Before we introduce our speaker today, our amazing pianist, musician, composer, singer, songwriter. Oh wait, I don't know about that, but
yeah, that works.
Brooklyn Stafford is going to be providing us our musical interlude today.
Awesome. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brooklyn. That was beautiful.
Very nice.
Thank you. So today, I would like to introduce you to our speaker. Our guest today is Jane Dixon, a lifelong resident of Westchester who has been dedicated to supporting underserved populations, both professionally as a teacher and through community service. She first became involved with the welcoming movement in 2015 and was a member of the kitchen cabinet of the Westchester Refugee Task Force, which works successfully to help Westchester become a U.S. authorized resettlement location. As congregations organized to prepare to welcome refugee families, she became the co-chair of Interfaith Council for New Americans in Westchester, a group of White Plains and New Rochelle faith communities. Since 2017, the Interfaith Council for New Americans in Westchester has settled 4 families, 3 in Westchester and 1 upstate. Jane also works with Neighbors for Refugees and Hearts and Homes for Refugees, 2 grassroots organizations in Westchester, which educate, advocate, and support community host groups. And as a footnote, she was married by the New York City ethical culture leader, Algernon Black. And her topic today is Belonging Starts With Us. Please, everybody, if you could, welcome Mrs. Jane Dixon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm going to tell you that I am not an expert on the history of the refugee experience in the United States. So I am going to be using significant notes, and I apologize ahead of time for that. Once we start talking about my own personal experience, they'll go away and it'll be less dry. And then after I finish, Fardeen is going to speak to you about his story, both what his life was like in Afghanistan and also what his life has been like since resettlement. And if you stick around, and hopefully we have time, I've got some wonderful pictures of the families that you have helped to bring here. So thank you very much. You may or may not know it, but this week synagogues across the country are celebrating Refugee Shabbat. So you happen to choose an important weekend to talk about refugees. I'm going to start by giving you some background on the history of refugees coming to the United States. The Statue of Liberty welcomes everyone with the stirring words of Emma Lazarus, but the US relationship to new Americans has always been fraught. On the one hand, we've seen the US as a global leader in resettling refugees, but on the other hand, we've struggled with nativism and administrations that have wanted to limit their admission. The story of refugees coming to the US is both heartwarming and painful. In 1891, Congress created the Bureau of Immigration to oversee the admission of immigrants, including those considered refugees, because early US immigration laws did not restrict the number of immigrants that the US would accept. No separate laws existed for refugee admissions, and refugees could settle in the US as long as they met the regular requirements for immigrant admissions. The Immigration Act of 1917 required all immigrants aged 16 years and older to demonstrate they could read. However, Congress exempted from this new literacy requirement all those seeking admission to the United States to avoid religious persecution. In the early 20s, the Quota Act set specific limits for the first time on how many immigrants the US would admit from every country each year. These acts made immigration easier for Northern and Western Europeans and much harder for immigrants from the rest of Europe and other nations. The strict quotas later contributed to the difficulties many Jews and other minorities faced as they sought refuge in the US from persecution overseas before and during World War II and the Holocaust. To our great shame, we turned away boatloads of Jews escaping from Europe. Many of them were forced to return and did not survive. But under a presidential directive in 1945, President Truman authorized displaced persons and refugees to receive expedited admission into the US within the framework of an existing immigration law. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948, the first specific refugee act passed by Congress, aimed to address the nearly 7 million displaced persons in Europe as a result of World War II. The act allowed refugees to enter the US within the constraints of the existing quota system. The law required that admitted displaced persons find a place to live in the US and a job that would not replace a worker already in the country. The Displaced Persons Act expired in 1952, but under the act, the US admitted more than 350,000 displaced persons. Following 9/11 and the subsequent creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and here I'm going to throw out at you a lot of names and initials, not to remember, but just to point out the different responsibilities each of them have. So the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, split into three. One was the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. Another, US Immigration and Custom Enforcement, as you all know as ICE. And then the US Customs and Border Protection, CPB. It was the first, the USCIS, that became the primary agency that oversees refugee and asylum affairs in cooperation with the Department of State, the Department of Health and Human Services, and other agencies. Within USCIS, the Refugee Asylum and International Operations Directorate carries out the refugee policies. In 2005, USCIS formed the Refugee Corps, composed of specially trained refugee officers who travel around the world to interview refugee applicants seeking resettlement in the United States. And this is really important to know, especially when you come up against the concern, the arguments that the refugees are not well vetted. Not only are they vetted by UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, but once the United Nations vets them, then the United States sends their own personnel out to the countries to vet them again. And you may have heard that that was modified under the Trump administration and called enhanced vetting. The president, in consultation with Congress, determines the numerical ceiling for refugee admissions each year. Historically, the total number of refugees coming to the US has fluctuated with global events and US priorities. From fiscal years 1990 to 1995, an average of about 116,000 refugees arrived in the US each year, with many coming from the former Soviet Union. However, understandably, refugee admissions dropped off to roughly 27,000 in fiscal 2002, a new low at the time after the US largely suspended admissions following the September 11th terrorist attacks. Refugee admissions rebounded from this low point. From fiscal year 2008 to 2017, an average of about 67,000 refugees arrived each year. And then during the Trump administration, it took a nosedive to a cap of 25,000. But because the administration decimated the funding and the staffing for relevant agencies, only about 18,000 were processed and actually entered. So that's just background to give you a sense historically. The numbers have gone up and down. We've been more welcoming and less welcoming. But what's the process for a refugee to be considered and accepted into the United States? They come via different pathways as immigrants, asylees, refugees, and SIVs. Let's clarify each of these groups because the terminology is important. Immigrants live permanently in the United States and may have status or not. Asylees have actually entered the country and asked for protection. They could have entered on a visa, they could enter legally, they could enter illegally, but they actually have set foot on US soil and have asked for protection. And it has to be determined whether or not they will be given that protection. Refugees have been forced to flee their home country because of war, persecution, or violence, and are asking permission from out of country for admission to enter the US. Also, there's another term, displaced persons. So let's talk about displaced persons. They have been forced to leave their home, but are still within the borders of their own country. So they could be living with family, they could be living on their own someplace or in a refugee camp, but it's a displaced persons camp because it's within the borders of their own country. We're talking about refugees here who have had to leave their country entirely. And the last category is SIVs. They are special immigrant visa holders and their families who are admitted through the Afghan and Iraqi Allies Protection Act of 2009. It is a special immigrant program which authorizes the issuance of special immigrant visas to Afghan and Iraqi nationals who meet certain requirements and were employed in Afghanistan or Iraq by or on behalf of the US government in Afghanistan and have put themselves and their families in danger from insurgent forces. This is an act passed by Congress. They are not counted among the number that the president can choose, the cap that the president can choose to set each year. What's the process? Refugees are actually resettled in the United States through 9 different national organizations. They are vetted first by UNHCR, wherever they're at. Once they're vetted, they can apply to come to the United States as opposed to some other country. And those vetted names come into Washington, D.C., where literally people from these 9 agencies sit around a table and look at the cases and decide which case they feel that they can handle. Just very quickly, I'll name the 9 agencies. You've heard of most of them, maybe not all of them. Church World Service, Ethiopian Community Development Council, Episcopal Migration Ministries, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, International Rescue Committee, U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the World Relief Corporation. The vetting process is often described as taking 18 to 24 months. But in reality, we know many refugees can wait up to 4 years. Once accepted into the US refugee program, they have to be vetted again, and this is where our own State Department begins to vet them overseas. Refugees then wait to be scheduled for a flight and are escorted by the Office of International Migration. One thing you may not know is that the refugees have to agree to pay for their flight through a loan, which they repay over what I believe is 5 years. Fardeen can confirm that for me. So imagine leaving almost everything behind, having the ability to take very little with you, and you're paying for a flight that's certainly over $1,000 and often closer to the $2,000 mark. For each person in your family, you may arrive with nothing, but you have already a debt or a loan that you have to repay of $5,000 plus. Upon arrival for their assigned US location, most refugees are connected with a local agency and caseworker who works with one of the resettlement agencies. And that local agency on the ground helps them navigate signing up for benefits for which they're eligible, Social Security, Medicaid, SNAP, and other benefits that their particular state may provide, as well as help with school enrollment, English language classes. By the way, refugees are entitled to the same benefits as American citizens as soon as they arrive. Most agencies offer this case management support for 3 to 6 months. A much smaller number of refugees are served by the community sponsorship model. In this case, a family is adopted by a host faith community or civic group who agrees to support them for 12 months. I don't have to tell you that during the Trump administration, the number of refugees permitted to enter the US was significantly reduced. In addition to the reduction in numbers, those agencies charged with vetting and processing the applications had their staffs reduced as well, so that the permitted number was not even reached. Another obstacle is that when the process is slowed down, refugees who have already been vetted and have waited and waited, they may wait so long that their paperwork expires and they have to start the whole process of being vetted again. Now, they have to produce papers and affidavits from neighbors and relatives, birth certificates. If you're a refugee, you're not living in your country. How do you get hold of another copy, or how do you get hold of those neighbors? They may have had to leave because of the danger. So it's a real race against the clock to get these people processed in here before their paperwork expires. And maybe Fardeen can talk a little bit about that. So as we're zeroing in from the national to the process, I want to talk to you about what's happened here in Westchester. Maybe it's the most exciting and positive part of the story. In 2015, when we were all watching the horrific news videos of Syrian refugees in refugee camps or on leaky rafts, some Westchester residents were asking what they could do. Several offered to open their homes to refugees, and that's when we learned how ignorant we were. Westchester County was not a location even designated for refugee resettlement. And even if it were, refugees must have their own housing unless they're being relocated with family members. In 2015, a small group began to meet to develop a plan of action. In order to be chosen as a resettlement location, at least one of the 9 resettlement agencies had to have a local office, and there were none in the county. So our first action was to build a coalition of houses of worships and civic groups and ask them to sign a letter of support for resettling refugees here. About 30 congregations signed on, representing over 2,000 members, ethical being among them. Now we had the evidence to see if we could find an agency who would open a local office. We approached Catholic Charities and HIAS, and by 2016, they had agreed. We held meetings in late 2015, 2016 to help the congregations organize and fundraise. It cost about $25,000 a year to support a family. And then HIAS and Catholic Charities provided training and a framework to use in organizing you volunteers. A core team of 10 who agreed to chair committees on housing, education, employment, healthcare, transportation, community orientation, finance. And then we asked for the very many volunteers necessary to work on all the tasks that are required. A sponsoring group usually has only 2 to 6 weeks to put everything in place, and we don't get much information about the family. So once we agree to accept a family, it's all hands on deck. Apartment hunters and gatherers to furnish it, tutors, drivers, employment mentors, and you have been a part of this. ECSW is part of the consortium of congregation that besides you all include Temple Israel of New Rochelle, Temple Israel Center of White Plains, Bethel Synagogue Center in New Rochelle, and right down the road, Community Unitarian Universalist Congregation at White Plains, my home congregation. Before the former administration tried to stop all refugees from coming, Westchester had welcomed 2 Syrian families. One of them had fled Syria under their own auspices and made their way to Malaysia, which didn't require a visa. But then they waited in Malaysia 5 years until their application to come to the US was approved. During the Trump administration, the pipeline of refugees virtually dried up. But SIVs, those families where someone had helped the US military or NATO or the Afghan government trying to put a democratic government into place, they were still being processed, although at a very slow rate. For the most part, it has been these SIV refugees that have come to Westchester in the past 4 years. Not all, but most. The responsibility we take for a family is great, but the gift of offering freedom and safety to a family is also great. We may think our work is hard, but it is so much harder to be a refugee forced from his or her home and all that one knows and loves because of the danger. So that is from a volunteer's perspective. But with me this morning is Fardeen Ghafoor, who, thanks to your commitment and generosity, has been here just over 3 years and who is willing to share his story and talk with us this morning. So, Fardeen, want to unmute yourself? He told me he would be just as nervous as I was and that it was okay if I prompted him. So I'm going to prompt him to tell us a little bit about the before story, what was going on with you and your family that caused you to make this really, really hard decision. And then we can talk a little bit about what your experience has been since then. We'd like to leave time for a question and answers, certainly. So we'll try and watch the clock. And then I do have some pictures of the families and their experiences here, which I think will be the icing on the cake. So, okay, Fardeen, I'll try.
Well, first I want to thank everyone because as in my family, we call this the volunteers, the angels who supported my family and others. So thank you so much for all your support. And so I will start with saying that Mahnaz, my wife, and I, we have 3 kids. My oldest son is 12, my daughter is 8 years old, and my youngest son just turned 7 years old. They love their life in US and they are enjoying every moment. So in Afghanistan, we were living in Kabul, which is the capital of the country, and living condition there is like you probably hear in the news. It's very difficult. The violence level is like increasing every day. There are terrorist attacks everywhere, and as you can imagine, life is much difficult. When we come out, like when people comes out of their house, they don't know if they will be back home safe and alive. And still they have to go to work to bring food for the family. But the terrorists, they attack like they don't care about anything. They attack the hospitals, the mosques, the universities. Every place is not safe, and explosions are happening anywhere. So things are very difficult there. And like I was studying at American University of Afghanistan, and they attacked the university and killed like more than 50 people there. So situation in Afghanistan is much difficult, and people are like living in fears that something is going to happen to them any moment. So if you're lucky, I can say that you will stay alive. Otherwise, people expect that anything happened to them when they are out, or even if they are at house. Nowadays, they start to launch like blinded rocket attacks in Kabul. I don't know if I'm using the right words. Like they fire rockets to anywhere that can hit, just to cause fear among the people because of the peace talks that's going on, to put more pressure on the government. So things are so bad. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I was trying to find out how to do it. Can you talk about how your work made you a target in particular and why you qualified for the SIV program?
So I was working for US military for over like 11 years. I started my work in 2006. And then at that time, at the beginning, things were much better. So I was working for contractors, and we were delivering the military supplies like food stuff, fuel, and other things from the main base that US Army had in Bagram, and from Bagram to other small camps in like 34 provinces of the country. So I was supporting those programs, and then the education program that the US military was providing for Afghan soldiers. Because of that work which I did, I was like labeled different things. They would call me like I was infidel, I was traitor, and I was not a good Muslim, and things like that. I was receiving threat calls. People like my colleagues were killed by the Taliban because of their support to the military, and that was all because we support the US Army mission in Afghanistan. And things were good until like 2010, 2011. And then everything changed, and this situation become worse and worse every day. So, and especially like in 2014, when we saw that the US military was withdrawing, and everything was, the Taliban were getting more control. So I decided that I will apply to this SIV program, and will try to get a safer place, my family and my kids. And I applied, and it took like more than 4 years until they gave me the visa. So although I was like working for the US military for 11 years, I was able to go to all these US Army camps. I had meetings with these the military people there, but still it took them more than 4 years to do the wedding process, and then we got the visa. So because of the support that we provided for the US military, we were always under attack and threatened by the militants.
Thank you. How about talking about what your arrival was like, and maybe the difference between the first year and the third year? How have things changed from when you first came? What was it like when you first came, and what do you think it's like now? What's the difference?
So as you can imagine, we came from Afghanistan, which is like 180% different than here. We don't have, we have like, we used to have 2 hours or 3 hours of electricity in 24 hours back in Afghanistan. Here, things are like different. So starting from these basic things, everything was a surprise for us when we arrived here. I remember like we were, at the beginning, we were so worried that what will happen to us, how we will get out of Afghanistan. But at the time when we got the visa, then our worry started that how we will survive going to US, because we don't know anyone. We don't have any job, like we don't have a house there, how we will support all the things that are necessary. So it was difficult, but with the help of the volunteer, to our surprise, when we arrived here, we had all the group of the volunteers who helped us step by step, from registering my kids to school, taking them to all the doctor's appointments to make the requirements that was put by the government to take all those vaccines and everything. So things went very smoothly and very well, I can say. So at the beginning, we were too worried that things will not go that well, but everything went well.
So could we open it up to questions at this point, I think? And Jonathan, I'll leave it to you. Do you think people can just unmute themselves and ask, or do you want to do it through a chat?
Well, normally what we do is we have a quick little, another little musical interlude, and then we open it up to questions or thoughts or reflections. So
Mhm.
maybe we could do that very quickly. So thank you so much, Jane. Thank you so much, I'm sorry, Fardeen. Is that how
Yes,
you say it?
yes.
Fardeen. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll open it up in just a moment, but if we could now just get a quick musical interlude from Brooklyn, that would be wonderful.
Alrighty.
Thank you so much, Brooklyn. I really appreciate that. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, a special thank you to our presenter, Jane Dixon, to Fardeen, and to Matthew for your technical assistance, and to Brooklyn for your music today. If you'd like to stay around after closing words, we will keep the Zoom session open so you continue the conversation. We'll also open breakout rooms so you can, if you wish, gather to talk to other people in our congregation. Closing words. If we lived in a just world, all nations would protect their citizens' human rights. But that's not our world. Refugees are just one result of injustice. Crucially, they didn't cause their plight. Rather, they are victims of profound injustice. Because their home nation cannot or will not protect even their basic human rights, they must migrate in search of protection. They are entitled to this protection, as all of us are, simply by virtue of being human. And that is by Patty Tamara Leonard. And everybody, thank you for joining us today, and have a beautiful, beautiful Sunday and a beautiful week.
Thank you, everybody.
And
Thank
have
you so much.
Thank you, everybody.